It started as just another mundane repair call, nothing out of the ordinary. I barely gave it a second thought in my dull, monotonous life that was void of excitement. At 55 years old, I had been living alone for longer than I cared to acknowledge. But when Silas walked through my door on that Wednesday afternoon, exuding a youthful, keen energy, something in me stirred. What began as an innocent encounter rapidly turned into a precarious mix of professional tension, revealing my ignorance of how easily I could cross the line between simple need and creeping obsession. I hadn't anticipated this shift. It caught me off guard, awakening a part of myself I had tried to bury. I found myself fixated on the leaking sink, a constant reminder of my neglect as water trickled down, pooling for days. This basin represented the years I had spent pouring effort into my home, only to feel a lack of meaning, especially in solitude. Every room echoed memories from my past, and thoughts of the kitchen were particularly painful. It had been the heart of our family life, now reduced to a hollow echo of chaos. Eventually, the leaky sink became a burden too great to ignore, prompting me to reach out for help, something I hadn't done for ages. I found Silas, a local craftsman. His name was just a name to me, merely a means to fix my problems. Expecting someone seasoned, maybe a bit worn, I was taken aback when I opened the door to a young man in his 20s, standing there with a toolbox and wearing a simple white shirt that clung to his athletic frame. He exuded a nervous charisma that unnervingly engaged me. "Hello," he greeted, his voice deep yet somehow slow. "I'm here to see the vase." His unexpected surprise made my heart skip, a foolish reaction for someone my age. A flicker of something long forgotten ignited within me. I stepped aside to let him in, watching as his eyes scanned the quiet kitchen. He had a certain energy, bending down to examine the sink with an ease that drew me in. I stood too close, pretending to busy myself at the kitchen island, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from him. Watching him tighten the bolts, I couldn't help but marvel at the strength in his arms and the focused expression on his handsome face. It had been years since I'd stood so near a young man. How did I let that happen? It was an elusive feeling I couldn't quite put into words, yet it tugged at me. It wasn't merely about his appearance. There was something else about Silas. His effortless charm brought a vibrancy to the room, a warmth that sharply contrasted the oppressive silence that had surrounded my life for so long. Leaning against the counter, I found myself watching him too closely, adjusting my robe that suddenly felt too revealing. I attempted to push aside the absurd thoughts creeping in. When Silas caught my eye, I saw surprise flash across his face before he quickly turned away, his cheeks tinged with red. An unexpected thrill surged through me. It wasn't anything explosive, but I felt a potent longing I hadn't acknowledged in ages. I approached him as he knelt, clearly focused but taut with tension, as if he were trying to disregard my presence. "Is everything going well?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He looked up. "Yes, just a small leak, should be fixed soon." A weak impulse led me to touch his shoulder gently. I could sense the intensity in his body as he tensed beneath my hand. It was a rush I hadn't felt in years, and I was reluctant to let it slip away. "You're quite strong," I remarked, my tone slipping into flirtation. His face flushed more deeply. Thanks," he managed, while I offered an encouraging smile, aware of the rising tension between us. My cramped kitchen, a setting of uncomfortable intimacy, saw him trying to maintain professionalism. Yet the small tremor in his hand as he tightened the last bolt told me all I needed to know. I leaned closer, intent on watching every deliberate action. He finally stood, wiping his hands. I noticed how he averted his gaze, striving to keep his composure. The need for his help was clear to me, but I doubt he understood the extent of my desire. He didn't nod but busied himself with gathering his tools, his hands still shaking. I reached out again, letting my fingers graze his arm, feeling the unexpected heat from his skin. Briefly, it seemed he froze under my touch, the conflict in his eyes revealing a struggle deep within. I sensed his age weighed heavily on him, but part of me recognized the yearning shared between us. But I was a woman who should have known better. At that moment, it didn't matter if I let her. My hand on her arm sizzled with electricity. Feeling the tension between us, she lay back against his arm, looked at me, breathing shallow, eyes wide and uncertain for a moment. I thought he might take a step forward to close the distance between us, but then he broke the spell and took a step back. I'm just here to fix the sink. His voice trembled. I was amused slightly. How fussy you were. Are you sure there wasn't anything that needed last fixing? He looked like he was mocking me now. It was as if he was mocking me. He looked like he didn't know whether to run. His hands grabbed the last of his tools, and I could see how he was struggling to maintain control. I took a step closer, my lips just inches away from him. You can do something else. You can take good care of me, I whispered, my voice low and suggestive. He didn't answer. He just looked at me, frozen. I leaned in as if I was about to kiss her again, but he quickly took a step back before I could. He put his hands in front of her as if to keep me away. I can't, he said, shaking his head. I felt a little disappointed, but I knew he wasn't going to give up yet. He almost ran out of the house in a hurry anyway, leaving me alone in the kitchen again. But there was one thing, the way he left was just weird. It wasn't. There was a tension hanging in the air, something unfinished, something unresolved. And I knew it wasn't when Silas said no because he wasn't interested, because he didn't have the confidence not to say yes. The days that followed were a strange mixture of excitement and frustration. I couldn't help but think of Silas. He had hesitated a little too much for his eyes to rest on me, really, and now suddenly I feel something there. It's been years since I've felt this way. This teenager who stirs something up inside me was it something I had been thinking about for a long time. Since the guy died, I didn't expect to see him again. I thought he probably told himself he wouldn't come back. He couldn't come back. But about a week later, my phone rang. I couldn't recognize the number, but when I answered, "Hi, it's Silas, the plumber." I was calling about the sink to see if everything was okay. He also kept his voice polished, polite and hardworking, but you could hear the trembling nervousness underneath. He was nervous, which made me more nervous than I care to admit. "Oh, Silas," I said, trying to keep my voice light, but I knew exactly where this was going. "You should ask. The sink is okay, but there's another problem in the bathroom I was hoping you'd notice. It might not be anything special, but I won't feel right if I don't get a professional check." I hung up there. I couldn't help but smile to myself. This time I didn't mean to let Silas go so soon. When he got there, he was more nervous than he was looking at time the first. He his usual calm, professional. I tried to keep up the character, but I could see the tension in his shoulders as I took him to the bathroom and saw the way he avoided my eyes. The tap was small, just a loose hand, but as he worked he brought it back and I knew it wasn't a tap as I stood nearby and watched him silently. The pressure of the air between us unspeakable. I felt my skin tingling this time. I was more focused on the task, but I could tell he knew me more now. He knew the space that lay our oaths are. "Well, Silas," I moved a little closer. "I'm thinking of you." And White Rooms, I noticed her breathing a little faster. His tone was cautious because he wasn't sure if he was aware of what was happening. Before thinking about this one last time, I kept my voice sincere. "He seems interested, but why?" At first he didn't answer. As his hand touched the faucet, he retreated, but I saw conflict in his eyes. "I'm just a professional," he finally said. His voice was nothing more than a whisper. That wouldn't be right, would it? Now I wanted him to come closer. "I feel the heat. Right or wrong, Silas?" I said. "I'm sorry. You're an adult, and I've grown into a woman. We both knew there was something between us. There's something you can feel, right?" His jaw tightened, and the same conflict from the last time hit him. He was struggling. I could see he was trying hard to be professional, to keep the distance between us. Tensions built up to the point of no return. And now I'm ready to let it go. Now I let my hand touch his chest. I felt his heart pounding beneath my fingertips, and for a moment I thought he might have backed away again, but then he inadvertently grabbed my arm and pulled me towards him. It's not rude, but it's solid. His breath, inches from my face, was hot against my skin. "Game," I never said. I smiled and pursed my lips. No more regrets. Silas's hand was still on my arm, but he hesitated as if he didn't believe in himself. There was something raw, free, extremely non-guarded about the expressions on his face, which melted into nervous gentleness now. Before our eyes locked, the tension between us mirrored something deeper, much more dangerous. I leaned in closer, making sure my lips brushed his only inches apart. He tensed slightly as if keeping me close and pushing me away at the same time. For a moment, I wondered whether he would flip out, lock the door, and never return. But then he began breathing faster, and I knew he felt the same way. Sometimes, you just have to let go, I whispered softly yet clearly. Silas hesitated again. Then suddenly, as though something snapped inside of him, he pulled me closer and kissed me. This kiss was neither gentle nor fleeting, but was heavy with all that we had held back, all urgent, making me shiver. His hands were on my waist, clutching me like he was afraid to let go. My arms encircled his neck, pulling him even closer. The world around us blurred. Every second, the sink in the bathroom was drowned out by the damper touch. His hands slid down to my hips, and I could feel the tension in his body as he held back, afraid to go too far. But we had already gone too far. We broke apart just enough to breathe, our foreheads pressed together, breathing hard and fast. I could feel his heart beating in his chest, his pulse running under my fingers. The look in his eyes told me everything. I should have known that this was not merely a brief weakness for him. It was something he had battled for a long time, something he did not wish to admit. "What is it?" he whispered. I smiled as his vision searched mine for the answer. I stepped back just enough to allow him to make some space, but not too much. "It is not far," I said. I could feel the tug between us, that undisputable connection that brought us here. "I think you know, Silas," I answered, my voice filled with a quiet confidence I haven't felt in years. It was already over the line. Why wait now? He did not speak for a moment. He just stood there, watching me, conflict flickering in his eyes still. But then, with one last look, he reached for me again. His hands returned to my waist, this time pulling me closer. There was no hesitation. No second thoughts were to follow. This time, we both understood perfectly what we were doing. That afternoon, we spent the rest of the time in a haze. Silas and I barely emerged from the bathroom. The tension between us dissolved in a way that felt both inescapable and unavoidable. His hands were all over my shoulders, waist. His touch was firm but respectful, as if giving up control, but still holding a little bit of restraint. I had not wanted any restrictions, not at this time. I hadn't felt this way since before the years before the divorce. My life was full of routine, long dinners, quiet lonely nights in front of a television, with an occasional call from my adult children. I hadn't realized how badly I wanted to feel this again, and I wanted Silas to kiss me deeply, to pull his lips down my neck, to let his hand slide down, grab my hips. I let out a soft breath, letting my head fall back. There was something intoxicating about being with him up to that moment. This young, strong man saw me in a way that no one had in so long. It was more than physical attraction. It was deeper, something neither of us expected but couldn't deny. We finally made our way to the bedroom. The air between us was filled with a kind of energy that I hadn't felt in years. I burrowed into the covers, sleeping together. A slight smile played on my lips because, for what seemed like the first time in a lifetime, I was alive. I hadn't done anything. Silas hummed with a low voice and followed his fingers lying beside me, tracing lazy circles on my arm. "I shouldn't have expected this," he said softly, his head turning towards me. His eyes reflected something brittle. He shook his head, a slight, mere shake. "But I don't regret it." I laid my hand upon his chest, feeling the beat of his heart against my fingers, and smiled soft. Neither of us whispered any longer after that. We'd both retreated to our minds. The weight of what had just transpired hung in the air between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if we had both crossed a path we didn't know existed, but neither of us wanted to go back. Silas finally sat down and looked at his watch. "I have to go," he said. His voice sounded like mine and was full of longing. "I've been here longer than I planned. You don't have to tell me." He hesitated to look at me, though I knew he wanted to stay. Then he nodded his head. "I don't want it to be awkward," she said softly. "I don't want you to think it's anything more, you know." I smiled, seeing what he meant. I sat down next to him. "You're a good man, Silas. We both needed this, and I'm glad it happened. But more than that, I don't expect anything." He looked relieved, but there was a slight confusion in his eyes, as if he wasn't used to such simple things. "So, you're really good with this? No weird feelings or anything?" I shook my head slightly and smiled. No, Silas, no strange feelings. It was just one of those times, no strings attached. He nodded slowly, as if still processing the simplicity of it all. After a long pause, he said, "I'll see you around." "Maybe," I said, somewhat sarcastically. "If my sink breaks again, you'll be the first to call." This made him smile, and he stood up. "Grab your gear and throw the bag over your shoulder." But before he left, he turned to me one last time. "Margaret," he said in a soft but sincere voice, "I have no regrets. I just want you to know." I smiled as I opened the door. Neither of us spoke as he left. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about Silas more than I'd care to admit. I remember the way he looked at me, the hand trembled slightly as he touched his arm, the warm kiss, the hesitation before finally letting go. It's been a feeling for me for a long time because I felt like it was something I didn't expect. I didn't expect him to call me back. I think he convinced himself that it was a one-time thing that couldn't happen again, and he might be right. Maybe it shouldn't have happened in the first place, but I don't regret it for 1 second. Still, I'm not sure if I'll ever see him again. I'm not even sure if I want to. The rational side of me knew that this was dangerous territory, an age gap, power dynamics, social expectations, and real possibilities. Crossing the line, I knew he was, but a part of me alive in his arms was not concerned. If he called, I'd answer. Then it happened one afternoon, about a week later, when I saw his name blink on my screen, and my heart missed the beat. I never expected it. There it was, a way back to excitement for what we had. "Hey," he said tentatively, guarded, as if unsure whether he should have called. "I just wanted to check the tap, make sure it's still working all right." There was a pause, and I could hear the hesitation in his voice as he tried to convince himself this was still a professional call. But we both knew better. "Everything's fine with the faucet." I lowered my voice enough that he understood I hadn't been talking sink. Another pause, and I could almost hear his heart thump on the other end. "There's another problem you could help me with." He hesitated, weighing his options, deciding whether or not to come back to me. "I'll be there in an hour," Silas said so softly I could hardly make it out, as if he couldn't quite make up his mind. It was just done, but somewhere inside me, I knew it would be impossible for him to stay away. I hung up, and a veil of longing draped over me. A good while has happened since I felt this kind of thrill. A claw into my body, alive and kicking, of nerves, fear, and naked desire coursing through me like a current. I told myself that it was a moment, not anything serious or permanent. But the truth is, I was wandering the house for the next hour, fixing bits and pieces that were not in the least bit broken while trying to release some pressure from the building excitement within me. This is just not me. I would never get lost in something like this. I never was one to lose control, to let recklessness breed. But then all the walls carefully constructed over the years by Silas and I came crumbling down when he finally appeared. I felt the same rush standing at the door again, though hesitant but apparently pulled towards the mutual attraction. His eyes met mine, and right there, for the last time, I saw the same flicker of doubt. But something else was coming in, something darker, more intense, and I could feel the crackling electricity between us growing. We didn't say much as I led him to the bathroom. This is not a big problem. It needs just to be fixed. But we both knew why he was here. When we were alone in the bathroom, the air between us was thick with tension. Silas tried focusing on his job, hands fiddling with the faucet, but I could see his fingers shook a little. He seemed uneasy, but nervous for the repercussions of what we were doing rather than how desperate I wanted this. So I just moved closer because his body pretended to check out that faucet, its eyes transfixed on the air between them, thick and heavy from unsaid passions. My patience finally waned completely. I wrapped my fingers round onto his shoulder. The fabric of his tee was coarse above the warmth in his skin. At my touch, Silas froze, his body going rigid for a moment. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe. But then he slowly turned to me, his eyes filled with the same conflict I had seen before. "Silas," I whispered, my voice soft. "You don't have to pretend." His breath hitched, and for a moment, I thought he could walk away again just like last time. But then something inside of him clicked. His face changed, his resolve breaking, his defenses crumbling, and without another word, he pulled me into his arms, his lips crashing into mine with a force that left me breathless. This time it was different. There was no guessing, no holding back. This time, Silas wasn't hesitant. His hands moved over my body with a kind of urgency, his touch filled with raw, unbridled desire. The sensation ran down my spine as I clung tighter to him, lost in the depths of that very moment. And we never stopped. I wrapped my fingers in his hair and kissed him back. The bathroom this time felt small for what lay between us. Silas did not stop the kiss, just picked me up, took me into his bedroom, where everything finally seemed to come off between us. The succeeding hours were a blind rage of feeling and emotion. The outside world disappeared. The body moved with a reverence in its need, and equal to my own in its demand. As together we let go of the wish that was trying so hard to be suppressed. And in these moments, nothing else matters. I am alive, alive than I have been for so long, it seems. The years just melted away, and I was no longer the woman who had spent most of her life wrapped in routine, in the quiet solitude of a big, empty house. There was no shame, no guilt, just the warmth and connection between us, the mutual understanding that we needed this. Silas's touch was sensitive and demanding, at once a mix of control and release. He kissed me with a hunger that surprised me, with a passion that made my heart race. Exploring his lips, I kissed him back with equal enthusiasm, reluctantly bringing him closer, not wanting to miss the moment. Later, as we lay entwined with each other, our bodies spent, the silence between us was more comforting than awkward. I can feel Silas's breath slow and steady on my neck, as his fingers trace the patterns on my skin mindlessly. I closed my eyes, enjoying the warmth of my body and the weight of his side. None of us have been around for a long time. No information was needed. We both knew what had just happened. It wasn't just a moment of pleasure. It was something profound that neither of us expected, but for the first time in years I couldn't take it. As a woman in my 60s, I felt I wasn't seen as someone's ex-girlfriend, but as a woman who still had the ability to feel, want, and live, but reality had a way, no matter how hard you tried to, you will hold the to him. As the hours passed, I began to feel the weight of what we had done. Silas was much younger than me, and years that seemed insignificant in the heat of the moment was something I knew I couldn't ignore forever. I looked at Silas, who was still lying next to me, his eyes closed, his breathing quiet. He seemed satisfied, but I wondered how long that satisfaction would last before the harsh reality of what we were doing set in. A pang of fear sent me unplanned for this. I hadn't planned on feeling anything but a tickle as I passed, but now that I was lying next to him, I knew there was more. I became more attached to him than I thought I would admit. Involuntarily, I slowly sat up, careful not to wake him, then wrapped the blanket around me. When the last rays of the afternoon sun fade, I look out the window, bathe the room in soft golden light. Behind the tree, this should not be the end of the matter. I know the sane side knows it's only temporary, but everything we shared felt immediate. Until now, another part of me has not been rejected. She wanted Silas to stay, and much to my dismay, the following days were filled with a strange mix of longing and uncertainty. Silas and I looked at each other. But something has changed. He's still gentle, still caring, but now there's distance between us, an unspoken tension that had never existed before. I know we can ignore the fact that it wasn't intentional. Silas tried to keep everything we had, but every time we're together I could see the conflict in his eyes. He had his whole life ahead of him, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was beginning to regret it. Age differences that once felt like an exciting taboo matter now. It seemed to loom over us like a shadow. I watched the way people look at us in public, curious glances. The process of judgment didn't matter when I was with Silas. I feel younger and more alive. We had not been out into the world for years. We were something unnatural, something really out of place. And one evening, as I was lying flat on the couch, I began to feel the heaviness of that judgment. Silas reached out for my hand, warm and comfortable in touch, but there was something in his eyes that made my heart sink. I thought his voice was saying, as if he was hesitating about us because he wasn't sure how to start. A lump began to form in my throat, but I nodded for him to go on. It's complicated, Margaret, he said softly, I don't regret anything, but I don't know how to do this. I knew what you meant. I was scared of this conversation, but I knew it had to happen. We had crossed something, and now we were both trying to figure out just where we stood. You don't have to explain, I said, my voice steady though my heart raced. I looked at Silas, whose eyes bore a sorrow I had not expected. I didn't want to hurt you, but I cannot continue to pretend it's normal. His words hit me as though I had been punched in the gut, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew this was coming. I knew this relationship was on shaky ground. I knew it could not endure forever. But to hear it was a different matter altogether. After that talk, after everything became unsewn between us, we still met. But now it was with a kind of awkwardness that neither of us could shake off. I could sense Silas slowly retreating, though he wouldn't admit it. I was scared of losing him, of losing that spark which had rekindled my life. I stared into the abyss of solitude and of empty days ahead that stretched into the horizon. Everything seemed unbearable. One evening, having gone through everything I had felt through, and with Silas, I sat alone in the living room, staring at my phone. Silas was supposed to come by this afternoon. The hours passed, and he hadn't shown up. A knot of anxiety began to take over my chest. Then, at long last, my phone vibrated. Silas, I am sorry. I cannot make it tonight. I just need time to think. I read that text message with a heavy heart. I knew it was to come, but when I saw it written down in black and white, it hit home. I had no idea how to respond. Instead, I remained there, in darkness, the silence of the house feeling heavy against my shoulders. What had topped my being with a rush of zest faded down to a hollow void I never envisaged being there. I thought that this was something that made me feel alive for a while before we both moved on, but it was more than that. I let myself feel more than I thought. The week had passed, and I was paying for it. Without a call from Silas, I tried to fill my days with tasks that didn't matter, but the emptiness followed me everywhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had ended, that everything we had shared was slipping through my fingers, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. And then one evening, just as the sun was setting, my phone rang. It was Silas. He asked if he could come over, and even his voice sounded near diffident. Of course, I said, but in my mind, I already knew what was going to be when he finally showed up. There was a tension in the air, not there before, and I looked at him tired, as if he hadn't slept in days, and the reflection of the conflict was etched into every line in his face. We were sitting in the living room. The moments of silence between us weighed more than words would have. I waited for his first word, but he clearly labored over what to say. Margaret, he began with a soft voice, I've thought a lot about this. I care about you more than I thought I would, but I can't keep doing this. I can't pretend there's no age difference. I can't pretend it's not complicated. I could feel the tears well up in the corners of my eyes, but I forced them back, determined to stay strong. I knew this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. I understand, I said, my voice little above a whisper. Silas looked at me then, and his face was full of regret. I don't want to hurt you, Margaret, but I think it would be better if we call this quits before it gets any more complicated. I nodded, not knowing what to say in response. I knew from the beginning that it couldn't last, but knowing that it didn't make the pain completely unreal. Silas touched my arm and gently, as if trying to comfort me, the time it offered little comfort. His touch was familiar yet distant, like a reminder that something had stopped. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I never intended to go this far, but I just don't know how to do this. I looked at him and my heart broke silently in my chest. He was right. We had crossed a line then that seemed exciting at the time, but now, the reality of it all was sinking in. The age difference, the secrecy, the uncertainty of where it could go. It was too much, and we both knew it. I don't regret anything, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. Silas's eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought I saw him hesitate as he reconsidered his decision. But then it was gone, her voice barely overpowering the narrative. I don't want to pretend it doesn't matter. I nodded, knowing there was nothing more to say. We really shared something beautiful, but it wasn't meant to last. And that's the hardest part, accepting that no matter how we feel, it won't last forever. We sat in silence for a few minutes, still feeling tied to each other, both trying to hold on tight to the last of what we knew. Silas stood up and acted as if he had slipped and fallen. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if giving yourself time to process what had happened. It seemed to seal the memories of the surrounding room. Then he looked at me. "Take care of yourself, Margaret," he said softly. "You too?" "Silas," I replied, my voice quiet. But everything we didn't say carried all the weight. He hesitated for a moment. Then he turned and headed towards the door. I watched, my heart aching as the door closed slowly behind him. As I didn't expect, he left the house. After he left, the silence was unbelievably loud. A heavy feeling enveloped me like a mist. I sat there for a long time, staring at the door, feel everything happening. The excitement, the connection, the passion, it's all real. But now it's over. The heavy body slowly stood up and walked towards the bedroom. The bed felt so spacious without him next to me. As I lay there in the dark, I couldn't help but wonder if I was doing something wrong or feeling too much. But even though sorrow covers me, I know I wouldn't change a thing. What I shared with Silas awakened something in me. It had not been present for years. It rang a bell in my mind that perhaps I still aspired to have a flame in my life, and for that, I would remain indefinitely grateful. The days that followed moved in slow motion. The crumbling routine of my life resumed, the same public spaces, the same empty grooves. However, while Silas was gone, there was still a fire inside that he lit. Something had shattered, but still, I could not completely deny this part of me. I had taken to finding time to think about him and would often try to imagine what he was doing and how he felt. It definitely was the right choice for both of us to end things, but it never erased the ache. A quiet yearning remained persistent in the back of my mind. Everything I couldn't really shake was harder to avoid. There were times I attempted to occupy myself with little bitty chores, cleaning, tidying up my bookshelves, and taking walks around the neighborhood. Yet, I was never able to avoid the reminders of Silas and the daydream of a possible world of what could have been. And ever sorting out a few very old photo albums one afternoon, I came across a photograph from many years ago. A vibrant, lively young woman. I stared at it for a long time, trying to reconcile the person in the image with the woman I who have become. I have spent years trying to conform to the stand that was set up for me, being a good wife, a good mother, and a responsible adult. In the process, parts of me simply disappeared. Silas brought back to mind the part that craved adventure, connection, something more. I couldn't help but feel grateful for the time we spent elsewhere and let ourselves be borne along by the history we created. I did not know I needed a reminder that I was still alive. When the weeks began to melt into months, only then did the pain of missing Silas start to slowly fade. It would never leave me, for there were still times I thought of him, where I felt the familiar pangs of longing really deep at my core. But this longing became rarer, and as the void in my heart began to fill up with new acceptance, I figured that my relationship with Silas was a temporary interlude in the monotonous symphony of life, a passionate yet ethereal dalliance that brought me back into the ear of myself. After it had performed its task, it was time for change. The silence that used to engulf each day felt less strangling. I had found a way to reclaim my own space. I started reconnecting with old friends, reaching out to people I had not spoken to in years. I joined a local book club, a thing I had always wanted to do, storing some creative fuel for my afternoons. Painting returned to me a calm I had not felt for years. And through it all, I kept Silas's memory in a quiet corner of my heart, not dwelling on it, not shoving it away. It was part of my story, something that helped me become who I am now. I sat on the back porch one evening after Silas left me, with a glass of wine in my hand, watching the sunset. The sky was painted on the horizon in shades of pink and gold, the air cool and crisp with the promise of autumn. And then, as I sat, I became aware of something that I hadn't really been aware of, not just the quiet of living alone, but life within myself. I had allowed myself to feel something real. Silas had come into my life unexpectedly and had left just as unexpectedly, but the mark he left on me remained to remind me that life is not always supposed to go in a certain direction, that the best things in life can come from the most unlikely of places. I sipped my wine and smiled to myself, thinking of the future. Of course, I did not know what lay ahead of it, but for the first time in a very long while, I was not afraid of the unknown. That was enough. I had found part of me that I knew was lost forever. It was getting dark as the sun set below the horizon, and I went into the house. This time, it was warm, no longer cold and vacant. It was once mine, and it now reflected who I was and who I had become. And as I closed the door behind me, I couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of hope. No matter what happened next, I knew I could face it because I had already faced the hardest part, letting go.